Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Applerouth's Path to College class of 2024. We are very excited to have you here tonight. I am Diana Cohen, head of strategy here at Applerouth, and we've got Mark Stucker, our guest expert speaker on college admissions, and Dr. Jed Applerouth, founder of Applerouth Tutoring. There should be a poll popping up that everyone can see. I'm actually not able to see it, but there should be a poll popping up just asking you some questions about, what do you bring? Are you a parent? Are you a student? Are you an educator? What types of things are you looking for your student in terms of questions and areas where you might need some support and help? So if everyone could take a moment to sort of answer some of those questions and helps us kind of understand our audience and how we can best set everyone up for success, that would be fantastic. And then I will dive in because we have some great speakers and a lot to cover tonight. So just real quickly about Applerouth, we're the ones hosting the webinar tonight. And real quickly to understand a little bit about who we are, as I can say this from personal experience as a almost decade employee at Applerouth and someone who's worked with Jed for a long time. We at Applerouth are all motivated by one single thing, which is that when you change students' self-beliefs, that you can change their lives. And that's really, about Jed, he's a counselor, an educational psychologist, and that's what got him passionate about this work, was seeing how, when you really can help students understand what they're capable of, you can really see them start to grow and change and become really great students and really grow as people as well. And so that's what brings us to our work, and that's why we do what we do. And the what piece of it is that we're out there building skills so students can see what they're capable of and really succeed in school and beyond. Specifically, we do that in academic tutoring, a whole range of subjects, test prep. Obviously, this is a college webinar, so SAT and ACT are probably top of mind for all the parents and students here tonight. And then we also do executive function coaching, helping students with their organizational skills and time management and just managing all the ins and outs of staying on top of the many things that kids have on their plates these days. So a little bit now about our speakers. There is more to say about them than I could cover in one webinar, but just real briefly, Mark brings 23 years of experience in admissions and college counseling. He is the founder of a he's based here in Atlanta, I believe. He's founder of School Match for You, but works nationally and internationally, and actually has worked all over the country, both in the boarding school setting, private school setting as an admissions counselor, has his own kids that have gone through the admissions process and done quite well and are now out of the process, so he understands it as a parent. He is the host of Your College Bound Kid podcast. Highly recommend that if you are looking for really good, thoughtful, well-researched information about the college admissions process to get beyond the hype. And so we're just really excited to have Mark here tonight to bring his expertise and experience. And we've got Jed as well. Also, lots of experience in this field, 20 plus years in education. He brings a background as a counselor and also has a PhD in educational psychology and is a nationally known expert on admissions testing. He's done everything from taken the tests a million times over, mastered them himself, tutored countless students, and analyzed and researched how do people succeed on them? How are the tests built? How do we master them? So again, very excited to hear what Jed has to share with us tonight. All right, so diving in to the next slide. I don't know why it's not moving forward. There we go. All right, so part one is, what do students need to know about testing? I'm going to stop sharing because this is a group of rising juniors. So testing is going to be top of mind, and Jed's got a bunch of slides here to help answer the ins and outs of testing for rising juniors.
Let me share a quick deck. It's just a short and sweet, and I will slideshow from beginning. Here we go. So a few slides, just the ins and outs, some of the key dates, things to think about when you're building your plan. The first thing you got to figure out with testing: am I going the route of the SAT? Am I going the route of the ACT? That's the primary thing to figure out. Here at Applerouth, we do practice testing all the time, helping kids figure out. You can also use your PSAT, or you can do practice ACT. And short and sweet, the SAT is going to be a more rigorous reading test than the ACT. The level of reading is at an 11th grade level of reading versus a 9th grade level for the ACT. You have more reading in every single section. On the English section, like the passages, there's more reading. In the math section, there's more reading everywhere and harder reading. The ACT is more advanced when it comes to STEM. They have a separate standalone science section, unlike the SAT, and they also have more advanced math questions. So a little bit easier on the reading, but a little more advanced on the math and the science on the ACT. It's a primary differentiator. Also, the ACT is a speedier test. You have to be faster. The College Board lets you have more time per question, about 40% more time per question on the SAT. So that's one key factor. To register, sign up collegeboard.org for the SAT, act.org for the ACT, short and sweet. Now, when it comes to testing, those of you, your juniors, testing typically is going to, range by now. It's May. I hope some of you have already had a first test. If not, there's still plenty of testing ahead in the summertime. We have the May is behind us for the SAT. We have a June SAT, ACT, then there's a July ACT, then an August SAT. And then you have until the early deadlines for many of your kids, if you're applying October, November deadlines, and then regular goes through, to January. So we still have about 5 more tests ahead of us. So by now, many of you have finished, your Algebra 2 is behind you. You are ready to go full steam ahead for the testing. You want to find out when in your life does it make the most sense, but right now summer is ahead of us. And so we're going to have many of our kids taking these tests during the summertime. That's great. But waiting until the fall is going to be, I would say, discouraged. If you haven't tested yet, I would say use the summer, get at least 1 test, ideally 2 under your belt. Fall is okay for a final test, but that's when apps are in. That's when you're going to be, everything's turning in. So ultimately, I don't want to have testing looming over your head, because also it can affect in terms of your list and where you're looking, in terms of being competitive and so forth for certain schools. So you know what? I think I'm going to skip that slide actually. But dates that remain, we have coming up June 11th. And so you can still register until May 20th. And then you have the July 16th. And then you have another month or so for that. And then for the SAT, coming up, May is behind us. We now have the June test. And then there'll be an August test. So you can still do late registration for that one on the collegeboard.org. Ideally, you will take either the SAT or the ACT three times. And we have research on tens of thousands of students. And we find that on average, our students hit their peak score by the 3rd test. And that involves super scoring, where many, many colleges will take your best math from the March test, your best verbal from June, and combine them, super score them. That's very, very common for the SAT and more so also for the SAT. We tend to see students get a nice jump in most all sections from test 1 and test 2, and then a sectional jump on 1 or 2 sections, occasionally all sections from 2 to 3. And then most of our kids are done by 3. Some kids are 1 and done, but when you're building your testing plan on 3, because there are gains in self-efficacy, confidence, comfort, familiarity, and also super scoring. You might swing 30 or 40 points just on how you do on different test dates, even without any kind of growth, just by the random fluctuations in testing, because there could be an easier math section here in June, a harder math section in August, hard for you personally, potentially. So you want to have a few rounds of it just to really hit your peak score. Super scoring is a big deal. You gain confidence, efficacy, and also it's great for goal achievement. Like one of our students just took the ACT 3 times, and on the April test, got her desired score. She opened up, she had a 30 on her baseline testing. She did some prep work, got a 32 on the first test in I think it was back in December. Then she got a 33 in February, and then she got her 34 in April, and that's it. And that was her goal. But part of it, as you keep showing my efforts are getting higher and higher scores, that's reinforcing, that's validating, and definitely affirming, and it keeps you on the path. So having a few steps along the way can help you achieve your end goal. There is a question, is it better to wait till I'm a senior? And the answer is no. What matters is taking it several times. These are called testing effects. You don't seem to get any real benefit or pop by waiting until you're older on this test, because the content really is, a lot of it's 8th grade content and 9th and some 10th. So the idea of I'm getting wiser as I'm aging to the senior year, we're not seeing a real pop there. It's the testing effect is what matters, not the maturation effect. And then finally, you want to find the right time. For many students, the summertime is a great time. They don't have the same academic conflicts, same sports activities. But otherwise, you want to find the sweet spot where you aren't overwhelmed. If everything is loading on you at one time, don't take the ST or ACT during that time. Try to find a time where it makes more sense for your schedule and there's a little bit more room. And then timing, you want to finish because you want to take your best shot early. ED means a lot more. I mean, it's a huge deal now for so many schools. And you want to have your best scores in for your ED apps, or ED app singular rather. Also your early apps, because for sure, you'll apply regular in January. But you know, you want to take your best shot with your early, and that's to make sure your testing is done before, you know, ID like October or the September ACT and so forth. How to prep? 20 hours is our standard model where you're prepping a couple hours a week. And then every 6 hours of prep, you do a practice test. That is our ideal plan. So you know, we're looking at several months. Cramming doesn't really work. Even if the same amount of content, don't try to put it in 2 weeks because you need time to learn it, forget it, relearn it, take practice, reinforce it. Time is your friend when prepping. And that is what I got for my slides. All right.
Great. Thank you, Jed. And before we move on from testing, there's one question that I think is a really good question, since this is for a group of rising juniors, so they're wrapping up their sophomore year now. We have one parent who's asking, like, should we be thinking about it this summer? Is that too soon? Does that make sense? And so what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, we have many of our students, and often even our top performing students, taking the test the summer before their juniors. That's very common. Again, you don't have other academic demands upon you. So if you finish Algebra 2 as a sophomore, you are good to go. There's nothing in your way math-wise. And then some students, if they're not as strong with reading, I mean, because the level of reading on the SAT is an 11th grade reading level, some kids benefit by waiting. But if you're a good reader already and your math is advanced, you are good to go. We have students who take it and knock it out in the fall. Some of them wait until the spring. But again, we don't see our data looking at tens of thousands of kids. We're not showing maturation effects. That's a hypothesis, but it really is a testing effect, of testing, retesting. That's where the gains come from. And so, you know, I think the answer is yes. If you are in regular math, you're a good reader, you're good to go.
Got it. And with regard to math, you mentioned the reading strength, and then with regard to math specifically, are there certain courses that students should have completed or at least started before they take their first SAT or ACT?
Algebra 2.
Algebra
That's
2.
really there's no calculus on it. That's beyond the level of this test.
Okay, great. That was another parent question. And then I'll throw this question out. I didn't see a parent ask it, but I'm sure it's on some people's minds. I mean, how much does testing, and we're going to get a little bit more into the holistic piece of the admissions process in a moment, but how much does testing, you know, really matter? Obviously, we all know that a vast, you know, array of schools are test optional now. Some were temporary, some are extending it, but test optional seems to be the way of the day for many schools. So what does that mean? Do students have to take the test? Does testing matter in the process?
And we could spend an hour on this topic, me and Mark both, because, and one thing, Mark is fabulous. He's interviewed so many admissions officers, heads of admission. He knows this from, you know, there are 2,500 four-year schools, and you're going to find dozens and dozens of different perspectives of what it means to be test optional. And are you truly test optional? Are you dedicated to the cause? Were you test optional back in 2007 or in 1990? And you can read very skillfully with kids with scores, without scores, or were you forced into it by the pandemic and now you're in a wait and see, and does it really make a difference? And do we know enough yet? However, for many schools, the tests matter a lot. Test optional is not going away. It really is, it's here. And test require, the Common App just came out with their 970 schools, only 5% were test required. And a small fraction are test blind, but the overwhelming majority is optional. We're going to see some trickle back to test required. We've already seen a few more, like Tennessee came back online. We're going to probably see Alabama, some other small, you know, and Georgetown, MIT that was a big news last month. But it's not going to be a groundswell. We're not going to see hundreds of schools ever again being test required. It's going to be more limited than that. So they matter. They can help your application. They can help you with merit scholarships. If you have good testing, it's part of the conversation. Only if you're applying to UC or Cal State, does testing mean nothing. Or right now, Worcester Poly for a few years. But otherwise, yeah, these scores can be a swing factor, a plus factor. And for certain schools, there is an expectation, if you're a certain population, that you have scores. You can get in without them. But if you don't have the scores, it's a little bit harder of a lift. So Mark, I want you to answer that too, because you could, again, this could be an hour talking about this one question.
Yeah, I would say even schools that have been test optional for a long time, if you're really having a candid conversation with an admission director, it's better to have good scores than no scores. Not having scores is going to cause a lot more scrutiny to the rest of your application, and you're going to have to back it up and show your intellectual and academic heft. So test optional gives some students some flexibility, because it's better to go test optional than have bad scores. And bad scores is completely relevant to the school you're applying to. You could have a list of 12 schools and you have very good schools for some, scores for some, and not for another. But even schools that are test optional, they would rather see good scores than no scores. And they, a lot of times they won't say that, because as soon as they say that, someone will say, see, I knew you really weren't test optional. And so that's very difficult for them to communicate that. But I always like to see my students do their best to get the best possible scores they can get. And then on a school by school basis, we'll make the decision whether to submit or not submit.
Okay, great. Lots of parent questions coming in about testing. I'm going to circle back to some parent Q&A at the end, but I want to make sure we get through some of the core topics here. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit away from testing and now to the admissions process, and thinking about, kind of starting with like, how should families think about choosing schools? And so, okay, let's talk about making a list. And I think, Mark, this would be a great place, one to go to you first is, what should parents think about when starting to make a college list? At what time in the process should they be thinking at it? What should they be looking for? That type of thing.
Well, I was really thrilled to do this, and Applerouth reached out to me and said, would you like to work with the rising seniors, rising juniors? And I grabbed this age bracket right away, because this is the time that I recommend really the formal part of the process start. From testing, I agree with everything Jed said. I tell all my students, start at the end of the sophomore year, take advantage of the fact that you have summer available. And that applies to everything. So when it comes to lists, there's several things you want to keep in mind. One, you're looking for an academic match, which of course means several things, like the right level of challenge, the learning style your child has, the size of classes, size of schools, the strength in individual programs, and many, many more things. And then you're looking for a social match. You do want it to be a place that is going to be fun. You want it to be a place that has opportunities in clubs and things like that in your areas of interest. And I call an emotional match, which to me just means it's a healthy environment. A place could be fun, but it's not healthy, and it should be good for your mental health. And then the financial match piece is often overlooked, and that's extremely important. And obviously, people have a wide range of different financial abilities. So if you're in a place where you can pay full price, that's a non-issue. But these schools, some of them are now 85,000 on pace to be 100,000 by the time rising juniors are in their senior year, and that's not a lift everybody can carry. And so it's very, very important that you have schools that are a financial match for your family. So that's the first thing, is that academic, financial, social, and emotional match. And the other thing is you want to have a range of different selectivities. You don't want to be like this student from Cobb County, Georgia, that called me a couple years ago. It was a big high school that ranks, and she was number 2 out of 658 in her class, and she got in nowhere.
Amazing.
Because
Wow.
everybody said, you're so smart. And so the list was Yale and Princeton and Stanford and those kinds of schools. And people don't realize that some of those schools have an acceptance rate of about 1 in 5 for valedictorians. Yeah. And so in general, people tend to have lists that are top heavy, meaning too many stretch, reach, challenge schools, not enough what I call possibles and probables. To me, a possible is like you got a 40 to 70% chance, a probable 70 to 95%. And then safety is 95 to 100, but safeties typically are schools that just admit by numbers. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And so having a balanced list is very important. And it's important that it's a balanced list of schools where you'd be happy to go to any of them. Sometimes people grasp the concept of they need a balanced list. And so just to please me or parents or some counselor, they have some probables and safeties on there, but their mindset is, I'm never going to them, but I'll put these on here to appease you. And you really want to build a list where you love all your list. Very briefly, I remember the student I was working with, and I used to do college counseling in a boarding school in Pennsylvania. And I worked so hard with this student to love all her list. And then she applied ED to Brown and didn't get in. And so I sort of put my other counselor hat on and start sort of moving into the consoling. And she was like, what are you talking about? You told me to love all my list. I still have like 9 or 10 more shots. And that's kind of what you want, the place you want to do. And that can be hardest because people tend to be more attracted to the more prestigious schools. And so the schools, like a lot of times your probables, if you're not likely to early decision to your probables. And if people aren't familiar with that term, early decision has an early deadline, early notification date, but it's binding, meaning you have to pull all your other applications and you're obligated to go. So people usually aren't going to early decision to their probables, but it gets tricky because schools increasingly are taking more and more of their class in early decision, making it more competitive and regular. And a lot of times schools will actually waitlist or even deny somebody who's too strong for what they typically yield. So yield is an admissions term. It refers to what percentage of accepted apps actually enroll. So schools will run their numbers and they'll say, look, we hardly ever get a kid like this. So let's waitlist them and prove to, make them prove to us that they really want to come, or in some cases even deny. So it's tricky, but that's what you're trying to do, is have a balanced list by all those different areas. So
Mark, I love this concept of really trying to love all the colleges on your list. And so to me, that raises the question of like really finding out about the schools beyond just those name brand names on a rankings list. And so can you talk to us a little bit about your advice for visits? And also now a new twist is that families can choose between in-person and online visits. And, what do you recommend about the choice between those two? And for either, how do you really get a good feel for whether that's a school you could love?
yeah, great question. So the answer to the online and in person is both and. You should be doing take advantage of the virtual visits. Every school now, you go to the admissions tab and then you hit the visit tab and it's going to give you an option, in person or virtual. You should take advantage of all that virtual stuff. First of all, you can learn a lot. It's very helpful from the convenience of your home. And a lot of schools are tracking that as well. And it can have ramifications for whether or not you're admitted. Schools are increasingly looking at the level of engagement from their students. And they have a lot of data that shows that the more students are engaged, the more likely they are to actually enroll if admitted. But you'll learn a lot from that. But you also need to get foot on campus. It's very important to do that. Now, I recommend you start out in your local area. And of course, it's a lot easier if you're in a major metropolitan area, but wherever you are, and you should be visiting a wide range of different schools. Because, I have students and parents fill out a very detailed questionnaire. And I ask them things like, do you want a school under 3,000, 3 to 12, 12 to 25, 25 and above? And I ask gazillions of questions. But my experience is it's hard to do that as a theoretical abstraction exercise. Once students get on campuses, then they can tell me so much more about themselves and what they're looking for. So you should be visiting schools. I'd recommend a city school. I'd recommend a school that's like self-contained, where the campus is set apart from the city versus one where it kind of bleeds into the city. I'd recommend more of a suburban school, a school in a college town, and a school that would be considered more remote or rural. Those are 4 things to visit. Then you want to visit schools of different size levels, and that's important too, because you'll get a sense from the size of this, from setting foot on that campus. And then you want to look at other things as well, like, there's schools that have a lot of rah-rah and school spirit around sports, and then there's others that don't. And there's just a wide range of a number of different ways you want to test schools by setting foot on campus. And I recommend you do that locally before you start jet setting all over and flying to California and flying to the East Coast if you're in California, because you can spend a lot of time and money only to visit schools that you get there and it's dead on arrival. Ideally, you get a few schools in the same area if you're taking a trip, so you get multiple bangs for your buck. You try to go when school is in session. Now, in session can mean summer school. That's okay. It's not as good as fall and spring when it's fully packed, but it's worth doing. This is a time you have more time. Sometimes people have more time. You can talk to people then. And I recommend taking charge of your visits, like not just doing the traditional. You should do the information session. You should do the tour, but take control. If it's important to you, if robotics is important to you, then try to set up a meeting with somebody in robotics before you get there. If you're an athlete, set up a meeting with the coach. And I could go on and on and on for every imaginable thing that's important to you. If you're a Jewish student, you want to meet with someone with the Hillel or someone in the Jewish Students Association, that multicultural, whatever is important to you. You have food allergies, find out what they do about that. Whatever things are important to you, you take charge of that visit and meet people. So you'll be able to build your list a lot better if you get on a wide range of different campuses. And that's one of the most important things you can be doing right now, is really getting a really good list.
So, Mark, in terms of timing for these visits, this group that's going to finish their sophomore year, when should they be doing these visits? Is it all within?
Yeah, so if you, and everybody's at different points. I find from working with this age group, some people have already done some happen to have an older sibling and they've tagged on some campus visits already. People are at different points, but I'll assume someone's done nothing. So definitely start doing all the virtual stuff now for any school of interest. But start out with what's ever proximate in your area. Take a look at, what can I do without airfare? What can I do within a couple hour radius of my home? Wide range of different schools. Like, do that over the summer. Do that. Take advantage of, don't waste these next few months to do that. And once you have a better sense of self, of the kind of school that you like, then you can start looking at working to build a list if you're looking at doing a national search or a regional search. Now the selectivity part is a little trickier. Most people don't do a very good job of putting balanced lists together. Most people overestimate. Their lists are top heavy. 80 to 90% of the people that come to me, and I have a good network of college counselors, we will all say the same. I was talking to a good friend of mine in Massachusetts, and I said the biggest challenge I have is that 80% of people come with unrealistic lists. And she said, Mark, 80, it's 95. so but there's a lot of things you can do. I do think that's a place where having some expert guidance is helpful, but there's some online tools if you're determined to do it yourself that can help you get a sense of your sense of competitiveness. It's very important that you get a balance. People have a tendency to be more attracted to the reach and stretch and challenge schools. So they go on a visit and they want to go to, if they go to New York, then they want to go to Columbia, and they want to go to NYU, and they want to go to Barnard. And if they like New York, they like New York, but they should be looking at other schools in New York as well. It's best to have your visits have multiple levels of selectivity.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's a good segue from this piece about talking about what should families and students be looking for and researching about colleges to the side of the coin that I think everybody thinks about all the time, which is the admissions process. What are the colleges looking for in the students? Another thing that we could probably talk about for days. So I guess let's start with this idea of holistic admissions. That's kind of the buzzword in admissions. What does that mean? When a college says we do holistic admissions, what are they looking for, and what's the order of importance of those things?
Good question. So there's really two ways that you can be evaluated, right? You can be evaluated by the numbers. I call it admissions by the numbers. The most common term you'll hear for it is formulaic admission. Some people call it guaranteed admissions. In that case, people are either basically looking at test scores and GPA, and in some cases, academic GPA, meaning math, English, science, social studies, foreign language, and crunching numbers. And you'll see different terms for that. Freshman index is one term that you'll see. Some schools are very crystal clear what their formula is. It's right on their website. So that's one method that tends to be used more with larger schools, public schools, in general, less selective schools. Holistic means that you're looking at the whole person. Some people define it as there's no low-side cutoffs, meaning there's not an automatic number that puts you in the denial pool. But I don't like that definition as much as to say multiplicity of factors are considered in who gets in and who doesn't. So what are those factors? Well, I have an illustration that I like to use, and it's when you go to the airport. When you fly in a plane, you have to get through the security gate. Just because you get through the security gate, it doesn't mean you're on the plane. You could go to the food court and miss your flight. You could do what I did once, which was fall asleep at the gate and miss my flight, or they could overbook. So you're not on the plane yet, but you got to get through the security gate. And the security gate in admissions is really a transcript review, testing, if testing is either required or if you submit testing and your testing is non-competitive. And if you don't have, and the transcript review is grades and rigor. So if you don't have like the grades and rigor and testing, if it's submitted, then you don't get through the gate. And a lot of times people don't present holistic admissions that way. I was just talking with a dean of admissions on a West Coast school that's 32 years in the business. And we were having this conversation, and she's like, yeah, Mark, we got to do a better job explaining holistic admissions. I think people think when they hear holistic admissions, they think every part counts equally, and it doesn't.
Not at all.
So holistic admissions, like if your transcript is not competitive, and that's grades, rigor, I'll put grade trends in there as well, and testing, then you don't even make it past the security gate. So let's say you make it past the security gate. Now there's a lot of factors that come into play. And so what are some of those factors? Your recommendations, all of them, counselor rec, teacher recs, other recs. Other rec could be something like a coach, it could be a club, it could be you're involved in a religious place of worship, volunteers, and you're involved in the arts, an employer, any of those kinds of things. So it's an adult who knows you really well outside of a teaching context. So other recs, teacher recs, counselor recs, that's huge. All the writing, extremely important. Your personal statement and all of the college specific essays and custom questions, those are all really, really important, and extracurriculars. So those are all really, really big. Other things that are really big are personal qualities. So schools are looking for things like kindness and intellectual curiosity, and leadership and adventuresome kids, and then there's a whole list of qualities, and depending on the school and what they may be looking for, based on what they feel their student body needs more, these things matter a lot. And then there's institutional priorities, which could be all kinds of things. School could want to build up more men in the nursing program, or in elementary education, more women in STEM. They can, University of Chicago has prioritized veterans this year in their recruitment. It could be geodiversity. Schools like to brag about how many countries and states they have. It could be racial or ethnic diversity. It could be program diversity. So they could know that this is a common thing that's going on right now. Like the humanities are under assault with all the focus on STEM. And so I was having a conversation with Harvard's Dean of Admission, and he said to me, Mark, it used to be that being in the humanities there's a term we call hook. It was like a hook for men. Now it's a hook for women too. So like internally, a school might know, look, we're about to lay off German professors if we don't get more people interested in German or linguistics, or they could start a new data science program or a new dance program. It could be anything like that. That's like a priority to attract people in this major, either because they're not getting enough or because they've added a new program. And so all those things are what we call institutional priorities. That's huge. And that's the biggest reason why certain people get in over other people with stronger transcripts, because you were an institutional priority. It's huge in admissions. And then the last thing is demonstrated interest. And that's a really, really big factor. As students apply to more and more schools, colleges start using very, very sophisticated methods to figure out which of these students are serious about me and which are not. And one thing that I would say quickly on demonstrated interest, I'm working on probably a 15-page paper on this topic, and I'm going to call it "Everybody Uses Demonstrated Interest, they just define it differently." So what happens is a lot of times admissions officers will say, we don't use demonstrated interest. And what they mean by that is we don't have some sophisticated, elaborate model like some schools have. We've hired a bunch of outside consultants to build predictive models that say that, if you attended a visit in person and you attended 3 events and you've opened these websites and clicked on this and you've interviewed and your essay's like this, then you have an 87% chance of coming. We don't do that in sophisticated level of predictive modeling, but that does not mean that they're not looking at other factors. And it's difficult sometimes for a school to say that they use demonstrated interest because they're afraid that, one, their admission officers will get stalked and people will start like popping up for their 3rd or 4th visit or sending a zillion emails, and they don't really want to reveal the secret sauce. I remember one admission officer I was talking to, and they used to have interviews for for a particular scholarship that the school had, and she would kind of hang out in the lobby with the baseball cap, looking like a student, and watch how everybody engaged with each other in the room. And the point is, now, if she told everybody that's what I'm going to do, then everybody would be probably really personable and nice and polite to everybody. So a lot of times schools, as one dean told to me, we're not going to tell you our secret sauce. So they're not going to necessarily tell you the secret sauce. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean people are lying to you when they say they don't use demonstrated interest, because if you go all the way to an extreme side, like a UCLA or Georgia Tech, the only way they're really doing it is if you're waitlisted, then you still have to reaffirm that you want to be on the wait list, but that's still interest.
Yeah.
So it could go from something as little as that to sophisticated models. But increasingly, schools are putting more emphasis on demonstrated interest as students apply to more and more and more schools, because they're trying to bring in the most gifted and talented student body in accordance with their institutional priorities, while simultaneously driving their acceptance rate down. Schools build their brand by scarcity. So they want that acceptance rate going down, but they also want to bring their class in. And so they don't like to waste admission offers on people that aren't going to come.
So this next question is really for both of you. And so, Mark, that's an impressive list of things that colleges are looking for. And then there's this piece about scarcity, right? So if I'm a parent or a kid about to embark on this process, I'm feeling a lot of anxiety right now hearing this list of things. So I think the piece of the question that's for you, Mark, is, okay, I'm a parent. I've just brought my rising junior to meet you in your office. Which of these things do they focus on? Should I be telling my kid to take a foreign language that's in high demand at some schools, or doing some extracurricular that might be, an institutional priority at another school? And Jed, the side of the question that I have for you is, let's talk a little bit about that anxiety piece in managing all of this,
Yeah.
and just acknowledging that there's a lot on kids' plates, and how would you advise parents to help, I think, both them as parents and their kids kind of do this in a healthy way? So maybe Mark, we'll start with you on the tactical piece, and then Jed, if you could talk to the emotional piece of it.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and mental health is a major concern of mine at this point. And so, one of the problems is people have a tendency to buy into the mindset that they need to go to one of 20 schools, and there are schools that are so competitive right now. They don't care who you are. They're what we call a reach for all. And so, a big part of reducing a lot of that mental health anguish is convincing people that there's a much larger list of very, very good schools. And there's a lot of ways I can do that, data you can show. And that's a big piece of what you're looking at doing. But can you repeat exactly specifically what you asked me, Dana?
I mean, how would you advise a parent that comes and says, okay, should I be telling my student to focus on certain things, or there's so much for them to do? How do they
Yeah.
choose what to spend their time on?
Yeah. So what I would say is two things. One is, this is why you want to get your list. The sooner you can get your list down, then on a custom school by school basis, we can have that conversation. And that's really important because I'll give you an example. There's schools that recommendations count a tremendous amount, and there's other schools that don't even want them. There's schools that these college specific custom essays count a tremendous amount. There's others that don't even want them, right? There's schools that your interview is really important. You got to crush your interview. It's an evaluative interview. I never mentioned that. That should have been on my list of things. And so interview and portfolio were the two things I didn't mention, but it's a minority of schools that have a mandatory interview, and especially an evaluative interview. And of course, portfolios and auditions count for certain types of majors. So I really like to get the list down as soon as possible, because then on a school by school basis, we can have the conversation of which factors for this school matter the most. But let me give you a good general answer, though. And the good general answer is that if you go back to what I said before about the airport and security gate, right? So transcript, rigor is going to be incredibly important. But some people go overboard. I've seen that. They feel they need to be in the most rigorous courses, even if their child's not doing well. This will probably bleed into what Jed says. So what I like to say is take the most rigorous courses you can take, but you got to be able to check 4 boxes off. And you have to have all 4. And what are those 4? You need to do well in those courses. And I'm defining well as A- grades or above, because that's what more selective colleges see as a good grade. So you need to be able to do well in the class. You need to be able to, the second thing, have good work-life balance. The third thing is you should be able to have fun. Have fun. Your life shouldn't be terrible being in high school. You don't want to look back at it as pure drudgery, and maintain good mental health. So take the most rigorous courses you can do while checking all 4 of those boxes. So that's extremely important. That's going to be applied for there's a correlation between schools that use holistic admissions and selectivity. There's a correlation. So if we're talking about holistic admissions, you tend to be talking about schools that are more selective. Now there's a range, right? Everything from schools that take 60% to schools that are taking 5%, but usually we're talking about your more selective schools. So understand that grades, grade trends, and rigor are going to be extremely important, and testing. Okay, now those other things, so recommendations, essays, extracurriculars, those things are almost always going to count a lot. So if we start with that, it's hard to know what personal qualities a school is looking for. It's hard to know what their institutional priorities are. There's ways of getting at it. You can't know it definitively. I'd recommend you read the strategic plan of a school, and I'd recommend you can just Google a strategic plan. They'll oftentimes reveal their priorities there. And a lot of times when they announce their class, who they admitted in their class, those announcements, you'll get some clues, but they won't tell you everything. So it's hard to know all the institutional priorities. Personal qualities, those are going to matter, but things I think people can focus on are the writing piece, the extracurriculars, and the recommendations, as far as holistic factors that they have some control over. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And Jed, I'd like to get a little, again, this is a topic that could be its own webinar, but just
Yeah,
a
for
little
sure.
bit of your maybe top pieces of advice for both parents and their students on
Yeah.
managing
And
the mental health piece of this
anxiety.
and staying in balance during, especially during the junior year.
Yeah, and Mark covered a good bit of it in terms of it. Part of it, when it comes to students and parents as well, it's level setting expectations. Really taking them from there in the cloud. They're not really moored to what's real, and they don't understand how the stats work. I mean, like you're applying to 10 schools, which each have a 10% chance of admission. You can get into zero if it's, oh, 10, I'm getting to one. No, zeros all around based on how this thing works. And so part of it, what I would often do is look at, back in the day, look at Naviance, look at where their grades, their scores, look at actually how many kids are getting in with your profile. Or these days, there are other sites too, which kind of show that same kind of trend, and getting a read on what should I expect? Because the more kids and parents are grounded in the true likelihood, if you're an unhooked kid applying regular, some of these schools, your odds are 2%. And so it's being thoughtful, being mindful, and then, having a good list that you're going to be excited about. I was working with a student. I talked to his mom yesterday. I sent you the email, Diana, from this one, and he did great. We finished up senior year, but he had a big list, and he got into Syracuse, he got into American. He ended up applying early to Northeastern, which is where he's going. But he was looking at UC Irvine, got things from Columbia, but he understood Columbia, snowball's chance in hell. UC Irvine. He understood. And as these things came in, it wasn't earth shattering. He's like, you know what? It's a long shot. I know it, but I'll take the shot ultimately. But it's not, his ego wasn't tied to the outcome. And he already had schools in his list that he was competitive for and he would enjoy, and be up in Boston. They have a good programming for electronic sports, and that, he's big into gaming, and there's like good clubs and teams. So he had a good list, and he knew these big reaches, if they didn't hit, it's going to be okay. He'd be okay. So you want to avoid the kind of, dichotomous thinking of it's either this or it's a failure. It's either I get this thing or it's, because some people, if you have that, you are set up for a fall and a loss and a lot of grief. And so I think part of, as parents, is talking them through, explaining, and if your kids are falling in love with Princeton, you have to have a conversation about really what is the true likelihood. And let's really broaden this thing open. And it's good to have a dream, shoot for it, but understand, yeah, 2 kids out of 100 who are like me get in. Okay, I get that, but I'm still going to try. So having a broader view of what success is, not tying your ego or self to this outcome. We all heard kids say, like, my life depends on where I get into college. And with the benefit of experience, Mark and we've 25 years out from our, we understand that's just not true. And we also, looking around our peer group, we know that some of our friends who are just crushing it in life didn't go to these name schools, who are killing it financially, success, their marriage, their kids, their career, and they didn't go to these schools. And so the idea that it's so limiting, so narrow, we're trying to control something, and actually having a little bit of trust or faith in yourself and in the universe, that if you don't get in this thing, there's still a path forward to you to achieve a life that's going to be meaningful and positive and fabulous. It's not just, this is this little narrow, I'm threading a needle, and if I miss it, it's over. So it's helping kids with your perspective, your experience, broadening and opening things up, and having, taking down some of the control, which is tied to fear. It has to be this or bust. Like, loosen that down a little bit. There are many pathways. There's happiness in a lot of, and trust yourself that you're going to find a path to your people. At whatever school you end up, you're going to find your people, you'll find a major, they're going to find a way forward in your life towards happiness, which ultimately is what we all really do want, I believe.
I say something a lot in addition to what Jed said. I wanted to shout amen for everything he said. A couple tools I found are helpful to help people convince them that this is not just pie in the sky, sanguine thinking, trying to put you in a positive state of mind. One is, I strongly recommend you read Frank Bruni's book, Where You'll Go Is Not Who You'll Be. So Bruni, he does research. He takes a look at all kinds of things, from Nobel Peace Prize winners to, all these people that have accomplished incredible things. And he looks at where they went to college. And it will encourage everybody. The second thing is, you can just Google this, where Harvard law schools went to undergraduate. Not that anybody has to do law, not that you have to go to Harvard, but I find this is very encouraging. They produce it every year. Current list has 194 different undergraduate institutions. And you'll look at that list and you will probably be shocked at some of the non-designer schools that people went through for undergrad, there's a mixture. I'm not trying to say that's all that's on there. You'll see everything. You'll see highly selective, highly rejective schools on there. You'll see state flagship schools. You'll see regional public schools. You'll see schools that accept 70, 89% of kids that they went for undergraduate. And then another thing you can do is just Google where CEOs went to college. And once again, I'm not trying to define success by being a CEO or going to Harvard Law, but I think when people see all this stuff, my experience is it's really encouraging that, wow, you really don't have to go to one of these schools to have incredible career success.
Yeah, I'll just add the amen to both of everything that both of you said. And it's really, I think we don't hear that message enough. And so it's important to spend the time to reiterate it. One of the things when we were talking before this whole webinar got started, I had said to both of you, if there's one thing that we don't cover for this group of parents, that would be a mistake, what would it be? And I think, Mark, you said it's just important that parents and their students know what they should be doing right now. And I think we've covered a lot of things that touch on that. But is there anything that we haven't touched on that, again, this group of rising juniors and their parents should be doing now, should know about now, should have in mind?
Yeah, so I like to work backwards. So when I'm working with my students, my goal for all of them is to have 80% of your applications in by Labor Day, and the last 20% by the first week of October. And the reason for that is, one, it's going to make the senior year so much less stressful. I've been doing this now for years, and the kids just love it. They love where they are. They can't believe, like, their peers are talking about things like, I need to take the SAT or the ACT, and they've got their scores. Or I need to get a college list, and they've got that, and they've done their essays. And the reason, and the other thing is, schools have priority admission deadlines. It's very common to have priority deadlines, and the very common date is November 1. It's a priority deadline. And a priority deadline can mean a couple of things. It can mean you're prioritized for merit scholarship money, or it could mean you're prioritized for admissions. Now, this is an extreme example, but it's going to make a point. One of the students I'm working with right now, she's looking, California student, she's interested in direct admit nursing programs. So one of the schools that she reached out to, they have a 90% acceptance rate if her application is in before November 1st, and it drops to 8% after November 1st.
Wow.
And that's an extreme, but so you want to get everything in. So knowing that, if you have that timeline, that means that you're basically 15 months away from that Labor Day goal. Now it's going to go really, really fast. So some of the things we have talked about, such as start your testing and start getting a sense of the colleges that would be on your college list. But one of the biggest things you want to do is get a better understanding of yourself. And that can relate to things like what I may want to study in college. So how do you do that? Well, it can be a good time to maybe take a course. Maybe it's an online course. Maybe you take a Coursera course. It hardly costs you any money at all. Sometimes they're free. edX, 2U, CLAP, all these people have courses out here. Or maybe you take it in person, just depends. I know we're coming out of COVID, or maybe you do an unpaid internship, but you trying to figure out what it is that you want to do, because that can have ramifications for where you apply, what school you apply into. Some schools admit by major, some admit by college. So discovering more about yourself is one of the most important things that you can do. And particularly as it pertains to your interests. And I would also extend that not just your college major, but also your extracurriculars that you enjoy. It's a really good time to pursue whatever extracurriculars that you love. I had a session with a family from the Bay Area a couple hours ago, and her son is really into this charity that he has started, and he loves this charity. And so that's going to be a big part of what he's going to do over the summer. That's something that he loves. So pursuing your extracurriculars, getting to know what college major you may want to apply to, or at least the area you may want to apply to, that's going to pay huge dividends for you. The other thing is have some fun. This is the summer. Decompress. Like, if you like sports, play sports. You like playing golf, play golf. You like travel, like this is a time to, I remember years ago, someone said to me, at what point do our kids ever get off the treadmill? They're always on the treadmill. It's always they got to do this to get into college, and they got to do this to get into grad school, and they got to this to get into this residency or this fellowship or this, that, the other. And they're always on the treadmill, and that takes its toll on you. So I think it's really important to have some fun, do some things you like, and decompress. In addition to getting to know yourself better, because getting to know yourself better is going to really make you a lot better as a college applicant. And of course, and that's in addition to the college things we've talked about, like get your testing, figure out your list, and those kinds of things.
That's fantastic. And I think it makes a lot of sense. We have so many questions in the parent chat. So I want to try to get to as many of those as possible. So we got some really good questions that go a little deeper on the things you've been saying. And I want to also emphasize, in conjunction with what Mark was saying, that it is really helpful, along the way, to get support for these different types of things. So if you have further questions, things that we haven't addressed on the admission side, on the how to decide about this class where you might get a B versus that easier class where you might get an A, it's, reach out to the counselor at your school. If you know someone in your community who's knowledgeable about college, if you have the ability to work with a counselor like Mark, it's incredibly helpful. And on the academic side, it's also, every student is unique and different. And that's what we believe at Applerouth. And whether you feel like you could use some support to get that GPA up to do that more rigorous class where you really feel like with a little extra push, you could get that A. Certainly this group is going to be going into heavy SAT and ACT prep time, and we are there to support with that. Or then if it's about the big picture and staying organized, on top of all those classes in this very busy year, we've got help with executive function coaching. And, sometimes it's hard to know where to start. So we encourage families all the time, pick up the phone, talk to one of our advisors. That's what they do all day long, is help families figure out where to start. But let's see what questions you do have that you've chatted in now. So let's see. We did have some good questions follow up on some of the testing piece from the beginning, Jed. So let's go back there. A bunch, I'll try to kind of group them, but there were quite a few about the PSAT. And, I guess just talk for a minute about the PSAT. What's the point of that? Is there any value in preparing for that? And what does it mean for students?
It is going to affect a small handful of students. There are about 8,000, scholars, a couple thousand commended kids, but ultimately the Psat is not a college admissions test. It's simply a practice test to give you a sense of, should I bother prepping for the ST or not? It's also decent practice. So it's there for information. And then for the tiny, tiny sliver of the top % of kids or so who are going to be the very, very top testers who might hit that threshold for the national merit. But again, that's so small. It's a small award. And schools, if they're going to give, merit-based aid, they're going to give it for SATs, ACTs, typically. That if you have really great testing and great grades and rigor, they're, and they give merit-based aid, that's where it matters. So I don't worry too much about the Psat, except for those, top 1% of kids who really thrive. And then we can prep them for national merit, for the cut score for their state. Otherwise, though, don't sweat it. That's the majority of people on this webinar and beyond. And only if the cut score for your state's 218 and you have a 205, okay, we can prep for that. Cut score is then you have like a 190. Don't even bother. Don't even think about it. It's too big of a lift. But then focus on the SAT or the PSAT. I'm sorry, or the ACT when it comes time for your actual testing, which is for college admissions.
Got it. Okay. And then if we do, it sounds like some people are seriously considering testing this summer, but are worried that they may not have time for the full 10 to 12 weeks of prep before that first test. Would you recommend against it then? Or
no, it's totally fine to spread it out. I mean, ultimately, some kids prep, for a month or so, take a break, come back. Totally appropriate, as long as before the actual first official administration, you have at least one session, you do a practice test. But they're definitely, it's totally okay to do, and some kids do like a 3-week, boot camp, then come back 2 months later, do some review. That's fine too. I'm just looking at, globally on average, you need a couple months, but it's fine to break it up and have breaks in there, as long as you have some momentum before the actual real tests.
Okay, thanks, Jed. Mark, a few questions here that I think touch more on some of the bigger picture admissions piece. Questions about recommendations, especially for students who are in really large schools and need to ask their counselor. And how do you navigate that if you feel like you don't know the counselor really well, or you don't know all your teachers really well?
Sure. And I don't want to put a shameless plug in, but we have a new podcast episode that goes live in 3 hours that has a 40-minute segment on how to discern 20 criteria to consider when trying to figure out who to ask. So if you look up Your College Bound Kid, episode 225, you can get a 40-minute answer to that question. But so you might be in a 3,000 person class, school, but you're not in a 3,000 person class, right? The class might have 40, or maybe it has 20, or maybe it has less. And so from a school standpoint, college standpoint, like they're very interested in getting to know who people are beyond just you got an 89, you got an 83, you got a 95, you got an 81. They really want to know a lot more about your character. And so they require teacher recommendations. It's very common for schools to require them. And you want to get to know your teachers as much as possible. If you can, it's good to participate in class. Teachers have a sense of who is contributing to the intellectual environment of the classroom. Just very, very briefly, because in case somebody doesn't feel like listening to that episode, you want to pick teachers that know you well, that like you. Okay, 11th grade is ideal because it's closer to when you're going to matriculate, and it tends to be more advanced classes. And you want to pick core classes: math, English, science, social studies, foreign language. They're not so much interested in like the cooking class for your recommendations, unless it's a cooking school, you know. So you want to be looking at that. And if a school requires 2, you don't want to usually pick them in the same subject. You might love history. I wouldn't advise that both your recommendations be history. There are some schools, I can think of several off the top of my head, that come to mind, that will require you to pick one in math science and one in the humanities. So that's ideal, is that you pick like a math science and an English, history, foreign language, if it's a school requiring 2. But if you're in a big school, the one thing that I will tell you is schools know that. I'll tell you very briefly, I was working with a student from a really big school, and she actually got a recommendation from her principal. And I was having a conversation with the school's highly selective school. In fact, I was looking, I'm not going to mention the name, but I will say that a 10% acceptance rate this year. And they said, this is really impressive because she's at a huge school and the principal is writing on her behalf. And I did admissions too, both college and boarding school admissions. And you do cut people slack when they're coming from a big school, and you don't expect the recommendations to be as descriptive. You try really hard to not hold it against the kid that somebody across the street is at a school where there's 80 in the grade, and every teacher knows them and writes beautiful prose and knows the kid extremely well, versus sometimes you literally could tell someone is almost looking up records and saying, well behaved, no problems. And it's really simple like that. So schools do their best to take that into consideration, but it's in your best interest to pick people that like you, hold you in high regard, and to get to know them, because when a student seeks a teacher out, ask to come to the office for anything. It could be, I'm struggling in this section, please help me. Or it could be, I just love that lecture you did on World War II. Are there any other resources that you recommend? I mean, it could be, or it could be, I just have a lot of respect for you. I'd love just to get some advice from you about blah, blah. Anytime a student seeks a teacher out, that teacher is impressed, because that's why you go into teaching, is for people that care about their future. And so something as little as that, one of the things is, in a bigger environment, sometimes you can really stand out because a lot of people aren't doing that. So the student that takes some initiative to do some basic things, they can pop more because most of the people aren't doing that.
That's a helpful way to think about it. We are right at time. I'm going to throw out one more question, and then what I'm going to do is just let everybody know where they can get further information after this, because the questions are coming in faster than we can answer before we run out of time. But there was, I think, a really good question just about, you talked about probables, right? And those would be ones that are in your score range and your GPA range. How many of those should people put on their list?
So initially, like if I'm working with someone building a list, I like to give them about 6, but I like for them to select about 3.
Okay.
Just to play it safe. These are schools that you're highly likely to be admitted in regular admission, not with an early decision application. 3 is a good number.
Okay. And now, in terms of further resources, we're going to send out this webinar recording with the slides. We can include also Mark's website and a link to his podcast website for those types of resources. If you need more help on figuring out how to get good test prep or tutoring for your academic classes or just coaching to manage it all, then Applerouth is the place to call. And there was a question about, if they want to find a counselor like you, Mark, where do they research that? Obviously, we'll send your website, but any just general recommendations for where people should be looking for that type of help?
Yeah, if they're interested in working with me, right on the schoolmatchreview.com, they'll see sign up for a complimentary consultation.
Awesome.
And if they're looking at other places, there's several agencies out there that have a list, and I'd be happy to share that if anybody emailed me as well.
Okay, fantastic. All right, thank you to everyone. Lots of great questions, great engagement, and really, most importantly, thank you to our experts, Jed and Mark. Thanks for sharing all of your knowledge, and it's great to spend an hour with both of you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.